He's definitely brutal, he's always savage, and you're definitely getting wrecked.
Excitement surrounding mainstream companies buying into the esports space is understandable. I mean, first of all, there's the angle that it suggests that if these big companies, which have massive revenues for a year and a lot of money to invest around the world, if they're choosing to invest in esports, it implies they see some sort of a future or potential return on interest, like they think it's a valuable space to get involved in, one that's something more than just a flash in the pan. There's obviously the validation that a big name company that you've already heard of, you've heard elsewhere in the world of movies or television or general media, is now buying into this space as well. That makes it also seem more legitimate, also encourages other people to get involved. But the interesting thing is, a lot of people won't realize this isn't a new phenomenon. Yes, it has certainly increased more so talking about the last few years, and it obviously will increase much more so in the coming years as esports seems to be peaking and getting bigger and bigger, and more people getting interested as things like franchise leagues, broadcast rights all get established, better monetization avenues. But you can go back over a decade and see big mainstream companies, particularly if you go to the top of the hierarchy of these companies. So the concept actually made me think of this video is there's a graphic that you can see online. I'll show you it now. And I saw it online a year or two ago, and I'll just read the top part initially. It says there are 1,500 newspapers, 1,100 magazines, 9,000 radio stations, 1,500 TV stations, 2,400 publishers, owned by only 6 corporations. And I believe this graphic actually came from like a conspiracy angle or something where they were trying to be like, ooh, look at that. At the top, 6 companies owned, because they're trying to imply, you know, think of the level of control they can exert over an entire country's media, but you'll think it's all these different companies, but at the top, it's 6 companies. So I'll put this part down so we can see the actual 6 big companies. So the 6 companies, you will have heard of all of them, are, we've got on the starting left, going to the right, we've got GE, General Electric, companies that they own, Comcast, NBC, Universal Pictures, what's that say, Focus Features. Then we have News Corp, so Rupert Murdoch's company. They obviously own Fox, most famously, Wall Street Journal, New York Post. Then we have Disney, who you might think of, they're just doing movies, etc. Obviously now we know they own Marvel Studios, they own Miramax, who make the Jay and Silent Bob movies. Your boy Harvey Weinstein, they own Pixar, obviously making all those fabulous CGI movies, and they own ABC, Television Media Network. There's Viacom, who owns MTV, Nickelodeon Junior, Nickelodeon as well, BET, Black Entertainment Television, not sure what CMT is, and they own Paramount Pictures, obviously a movie studio. Time Warner owns CNN, HBO, AOL, Warner Brothers. CBS has companies like Showtime, Smithsonian Channel, NFL.com, Jeopardy, 60 Minutes. Now, these are the big 6 companies, and this obviously was not a graphic related to esports, but I can show you, to highlight the penetration of these mainstream companies into esports and the increasing trend, how all 6 of these companies currently own properties or invested in properties within the esports space and spanning over a decade, as I alluded to before. So, first of all, just to talk about this concept a little bit. If tons of these media companies are only owned by 6 companies or corporations, well, there's the angle where business obviously to some degree follows culture, right? Whatever happens in culture, social phenomena, things that go viral, hobbies that come along that people get interested in, new areas that before they weren't so interested in now becomes a massive area of art, entertainment. Obviously, these companies are generally going to be behind the trend. They're going to notice the trend, and then once they notice it early on, it's starting to show some signs. They're going to buy in as soon as they can, so they can first of all profit from the trend, but also they can direct it, they can control it, they can to some degree, and this is where the conspiracy angle presumably came in with that, censor things, ensure that you are shown one thing, not shown another thing. And if they own enough of the space, You're not going to know that certain things exist, but more importantly, you won't even be aware that you're not being told about them or that they don't exist. You will think naively that what you see is all that exists and is all that is newsworthy, fit to print, relevant, important to you in your life. So media control right now isn't such a big deal within the esports space, but as this penetration and buying up key properties within the space becomes more and more of a trend, more and more of a pattern, it will be something to think about in the future in terms of how some of these companies might choose to direct esports, what their vision is for it, how they might choose to control esports. They might censor elements of it, might censor certain games, might not be interested in allowing certain people, certain broadcasters to be involved in it. Obviously, we won't be in such an open circuit, such an open system at that point in time because of the rights they have. So my interest is to watch how control evolves and also to see how these parent companies at the very top and then the subsidiaries below, like some of those I listed off, choose to buy companies in the esports space. What is their vision? What are they seeing as what's valuable, and hence which companies they choose to buy in terms also of implied value, like buying a team and a tournament organizer and a league structure and a broadcaster. Which of these will they choose to do? Will there be conflicts of interest as we've seen elsewhere in esports? Will they spread it out? Will they try to monopolize and control an area? And more importantly, will they use different subsidiaries to buy these different areas? Because obviously that's one of the things that people get confused about, which is why a graphic like that was created. People understand that, oh yeah, there's CNN and there's Fox, and then obviously over here we've got Caffeine and we've got Twitch here and we've got all this. They understand that, but the part they got confused by is unless you know who's owned at the top by the parent companies, you might think there's a bunch of competitors who might in their own space be competitors and not realize that one person ultimately could in theory control all of them. Obviously he gives a level of autonomy to each person as the hierarchy goes down, but it's more significant in that sense because you'll never quite know if the net is closing around you, metaphorically, unless you know who owns these things and who can potentially pull the strings. I also want to see, as I alluded to before, what conflicts of interest we'll see in the future. I mean, competition itself can play out very differently depending on who owns the company. A great example of this, obviously, would be when Amazon bought Twitch. They bought them for, I think it was like, the problem is it was reported a bunch of different places. I think the final figure was around 970 million. People might remember that before Amazon actually bought them, it was Google who was in bidding to buy them. This is like back in 2014, 2013, I think was when the negotiations began. At the time, that was reported to be a deal worth over 1 billion, but it ended up being sold for just under 1 billion to Twitch, which now, when you look at some of the valuations of some of the individual esports organizations, looks like a steal. When you look at how much it now costs to buy an Overwatch League spot, in theory, $20 million. Again, just under 1 billion seems like a steal for a massive thing like Twitch, which can obviously have insane impact on esports and in the future could exert a lot of control as well as making you a lot of money. So obviously Google not buying Twitch at that point in time also has a huge knock-on effect in as much as Google obviously owns YouTube. So they could have had something of a small monopoly over esports. You could already argue they have something of a soft monopoly with Twitch, but they don't entirely. We do see broadcast rights sold like with EPL and ECS and Counter-Strike, and obviously with Azubu in the past. And we even heard rumours that the Overwatch League, if they hadn't gotten the big Twitch deal, might have gone with someone like Azubu, might have gone with MLG TV type scenarios, you know, in order to push their hand. They probably didn't want to, but you can see that's happening. Now, one of the reasons why this is going to increase and is going to continue isn't just that esports is a hot new space and that it controls a certain demographic of people who are cord cutters, which makes it even more valuable to be able to influence these people culturally and get certain information in front of them and potentially block other information. But more importantly, these are people who are jumping from a ship that is sinking onto anything they can get. Yeah, a lifeboat isn't better than a whole galleon, but if the galleon's sinking, the lifeboat might be worth it at this point in time, might be worth moving to that, right? Especially in this scenario, I guess the analogy is that then you can build out the lifeboat and make it a new galleon or an even bigger, like a full sea liner or something would be the logic here, right? So as traditional media dies out, as a newer generation of people become cord cutters, as they become more interested in playing games than watching things, you will see the companies that previously catered to those aspects for this demographic shifting over and buying companies within this space. Now, as I alluded to before, the whole subsidiary element where people don't know who the parent company is at the very top is what will throw people off and make people not realize it's even something to be concerned about. Interestingly, though, I will contrast that before we look at these companies, I give you examples, with the whole chaebol concept in South Korea, where it's basically like families that dynastically sort of own massive companies that, again, some of them are media conglomerates, some of them are like national corporations that have massive reach internally in Korea and sometimes even externally, the likes of Samsung, etc. Some of these companies, if you go to the top, not only are they run by families in sort of almost like an old-fashioned, like almost like a feudalized system, but people see that and then they find out that there are conflicts of interest, like CJ, the company, owned on GameNet, which was the broadcaster and tournament organizer of OGN Champions in the LCK, but then they had a team called CJ Entus, owned by the same company, playing within that league, but then there are rival companies to CJ Entus, also being able to play within the same league, which is then run by the tournament organizer that's owned by their rival and then broadcast by their rival. So you can see there is all sorts of stuff. And when people hear that from the outside, when they're not Korean, they think this is a conflict of interest. Like, I'm very suspicious of this business setup, but they aren't aware that in North America, primarily where those companies I showed you are, there is a similar scenario for mainstream media culture that as it starts to get involved in esports, you see who the ones making the investments are. It will become the case that they will potentially be able to exert similar control over the esports space. So let's look at some of these companies, some of these investments by these 6 big companies, and you will see how all 6 now have invested in the esports space or have outright bought properties or in the past did so. So I thought an interesting way to actually illustrate this is something I thought of immediately when I saw the 6 companies. Because when I saw the 6 companies, I thought to myself, I wonder how much these have actually been involved in esports. And I looked at the 6, and what I tried to do was figure out, in my own career, some of the paths not taken, the offers that I had that I didn't take, if I'd have taken some of those, which of these companies might I have ended up working for? More importantly, offers I did take, jobs I have had in esports, did I work for any of these companies? Again, I myself didn't know because I only knew the subsidiary companies. Some of these particular companies and the fact that they were owned by these big 6 companies that I would have thought maybe aren't even involved in esports because it's only a company that's owned by them who then got involved. So we'll start off here. This is the website. It's technically, as you'll see at the top, GameSpot, because the website On Gamers no longer exists. The site itself was taken down, but it is owned. On Gamers was owned by CBSI, who also owns GameSpot, the games review website, and CBSI is obviously owned by CBS, and CBS, you go to the top, there's one of the companies that we're talking about, right? So On Gamers was a website I worked for from late 2013 through to late 2014. It was set up as kind of a mega esports site. You can see here there's an article that I wrote, which is still hosted on GameSpot because they hosted all the content when the site went down. This was an article about CLG the legendary European team who's one of the best in League of Legends history. This one was set up as the ultimate coverage site. Before ESPN Esports and The Score came along, this was the biggest attempt to do a big mainstream esports site. So what they did was they went out there with a big budget from CBSI and they got a lot of different big name content creators and they got them all in one site and they tried to make it the biggest site with the biggest content, get the most views, and that was going to somehow, there was a business model attached to that. Now, it didn't work out. I got fired from the site, and obviously the site itself closed down. Everyone ended up not working for the site within, I think, less than a year after I'd been fired, actually. I think it was only open for a couple of years. But some of the people who worked for this site, so I worked for this site, Travis Gafford, one of the most famous interviewers and journalists in League of Legends, worked for this site, Slasher, quite a famous esports journalist. If you go back sort of like 3 or 4 years or more, go back 10 years, he's pretty famous, not as famous more recently, especially not in the Overwatch era, because he only does leaks nowadays from Discord. You had certain people who aren't even as famous in the journalism space anymore. So, for example, Hunter Lay, who later worked with Riot Games. And I'm not sure if he still does, but I know he worked with the Golden Guardians as well as like a general manager or something, some key position. Cyborg Matt, if you come from Dota 2, a guy who was involved with the management of Team Secret, was working for this site where he used to do patch note updates that were very, very popular. Hunter Lay, by the way, was actually my boss at one point in time, briefly on Gamers. Then we'll go and look at some of the other companies that are out there. So there's CBS, there's 1E6. Then we go to this. So you'll see here, we have to go on the Wayback Machine because this website also does not exist on the internet anymore. And this is the Championship Gaming Series. Now, the Championship Gaming Series, or the CGS, is actually going to be the oldest of the examples I give you here. This was owned by News Corp through DirecTV, which is a cable channel that you have to, a paid for cable channel in North America. And Championship Gaming Series, which launched in 2007, was a esports league which featured games like CS Source, Dead or Alive, I think it was Dead or Alive 4, Forza Racing, FIFA Soccer. There's a number of different esports games included within this. It had a very weird system where the franchises within the league were owned by the league. They were bought from the owners, and then they like appointed people to run the franchises, and then the franchise system actually sort of, to some degree, ruined the actual esports or competitive end of the equation, because what would happen was, it's not like you just had your Counter-Strike Source team play against the other guy's Counter-Strike Source team, and you won that, and that made you go higher in the league table. Counter-Strike Source won you points, which were then also balanced again how many points you won in FIFA and in Dead or Alive and in the racing game. And then it was overall points that the franchise had that week in that match against all the games of the other team that determined who won the match. So I would say quite an ill-informed, ill-advised, just quite a poor attempt at making a competitive structure. But this was more because it was a TV concept. It was supposed to be half like reality show as well as new sport to watch. And this was something that which obviously failed after a couple of years. But some of the people who worked for this site, okay, this is a site I could have worked for. At the time, there was a lot of people who were my peers who worked for them. I had offers from certain franchises. I actually did do a little bit of writing for, I think it was the Chicago Chimera, very early on, the one that was owned by DKT and actually won the first season of Championship Gaming Series. But aside from that, I didn't particularly work under this organization or this structure at all. But some people you will know who did. Heaton, legendary 1.6 player, was one of the managers of the, I think it was the Stockholm Magnetic or whatever they're called, franchise. Fatality, legendary dueler, at one point in time had the most prize money won in history, obviously being now far surpassed by Dota players. He was actually one of the commentators. Notably, he commentated actually CS Source as well, even though he wasn't a Counter-Strike guy, which some people criticised him for. You had someone like Torbull, who now works with ESEA, which is a company he owned, and then obviously now through them with ESL. This is a guy who was previously the manager of Team 3D, and he was working with the CGS here. He sold CGS, Team 3D to CGS, and then they appointed Dave Moto Giffon, former player, as the manager of that team. And Torbull was more of like a figure within the structure of CGS. Jason Lake, current owner of Complexity, himself, when he was the owner of Complexity, sold it to the CGS and became the manager of that franchise. DJ Wheat, legendary commentator for esports, now works within Twitch. Not sure what his role is there. He was actually the main commentator of the Championship Gaming Series because he really was the voice of esports back then. And another very famous commentator, another on-camera personality you will definitely know, Red Eye, legendary, particularly Counter-Strike figure, but he's obviously worked in many, many different games, been around a long, long time, through the Quad V days, all different companies, worked with the ESL, nowadays has his own esports talent organization, agency called Code Red Esports, and obviously still appears at Dota tournaments, doing hosting, doing interviewing, doing stage hosting, desk hosting, and all around talent, obviously. So many people, obviously, they're working with CGS. I didn't myself overall work with them, but could have done in that particular sense. Then we come to one that you'll know much, much better, which is obviously going to be E-League, which is owned by Turner, because it's their TV channel. This is a TV show, and the TV show is owned by Turner, which is owned by Time Warner. We get to Time Warner at the top, right? TBS. So E-League was a television show, it still is, which featured, in my case, Counter-Strike CSGO, Counter-Strike Global Offensive, but also has featured obviously Rocket League, many fighting games, Street Fighter, Injustice, I think Mortal Kombat was one as well. Now, this company, obviously, it's a TV show that's part of a network, the one basic cable channel in America, TBS, which is part when you go to the top of the Time Warner company. So obviously I worked as a freelancer for them, as did Alchemist, for example, who later worked as a freelance producer for the Overwatch League and now is doing some other stuff. Richard Lewis was actually an employee, the famous esports journalist, was an employee of the company, and he was also obviously the face of the brand in terms of the esports shows, desk host of pretty much all of them, except I think the Overwatch Open, since Blizzard for some reason didn't want him to be part of it. Draw your own conclusions there. So there's another company that everyone knows. ESPN Esports. Now, ESPN, if you go up to the top, is owned by Disney. And this site came around, I should probably give them years for these, right? So CGS was 2007, OnGamers was started in, I think, 2013, E-League started in 2016, and ESPN, I think, also was launched in 2016. Now, ESPN at the top is owned by Disney. Interesting detail for you there. If you go to the top of this particular part here, you can see I've got the tab Esports open, right? And if you go to Esports, I've got Home, Esports Calendar, League of Legends, Overwatch, ESPN Esports. No Counter-Strike Global Offensive, despite the fact it's one of the biggest premier esports games in the world. They definitely cover it on the website. You've seen numbers of pieces of content there. Now, that's actually relevant to the fact that they're owned at the top by Disney, because I heard, again, this is a rumor. I'm not claiming I'm factually sourcing it and that I've corroborated it all. But the rumor I'd heard was that the fact that Disney owns them means they didn't want games that were about shooting people with guns. I know Overwatch technically is like that, but obviously there's the terrorism theme to Counter-Strike to directly be sort of advertised by the site, which is why, for some bizarre reason, it doesn't get its own subsection, even though it's still covered as a game. Whatever, it's a workaround. They're still able to cover Counter-Strike. Who really cares, ultimately, right? I guess you might in a way. But whatever, there wouldn't be a lot of big coverage sites. I mean, OnGamers, the one I worked for, doesn't exist anymore. The Score Esports let a lot of their full-time people go and mainly just use the odd freelancer or just their own staff from the other main The Score site. So you can see, I don't begrudge ESPN in that sense for playing ball with Disney in this respect, because there aren't many big sites like this can afford to give people full-time salaries and all the resources to do big-time mainstream-type journalism. There's a lot of, it's still fairly amateur hour-ish at many other websites, quite frankly. So ESPN, obviously this year's Esports Industry Journalist of the Year award winner works for them. Jacob Wolf, one of the best journalists in esports, especially in the investigative field. Emily Rand, I think one of the best general content journalists in esports. I don't believe she works full-time here, but she's certainly freelanced a lot, and maybe she's like half and half on that one. She's been on a lot of their shows. Obviously, at one point in time, Slasher also worked for this particular site, although not for very long. Admittedly, didn't do many pieces of work, which is part of the problem. So obviously ESPN, again, I'm listing as a site that in theory I could have worked with. They actually asked me to do an article in the early days to launch the site, a Counter-Strike Global Offensive article. And this is the type of site, along with The Score, and obviously I did work for OnGamers, the type of site that in the past I have worked for. I just haven't worked for this particular site, and obviously that would have been a Disney example. So those are the examples of companies that like I clearly could have worked with, and therefore I thought, well, interesting, I could have actually potentially worked for 4 of the 6 companies, right? But then you might be asking, what about the other 2 companies? Which, if you can remember, if you've been following, we've had CBS, Time Warner, News Corp, Disney. So who are the other 2 companies? They were Viacom and GE. So if you want to go and look at how they've impacted esports, Super League Gaming is a fairly new league, which has a very bizarre concept because they've bought like broadcast rights to some of these games. So we've got like League of Legends, Minecraft, Clash Royale, and their concept is kind of like the Overwatch League. They're using geolocation where there will be like city-based franchises as far as I can tell, and that's going to be like what's going to run. Now you might ask, how are they going to run League of Legends? Is it a collegiate system? Because obviously they're not going to have LCS teams and players. Minecraft, I don't particularly even consider that esports, but whatever. Clash Royale, vaguely approaching esports. I'm not really that clear, but it is a multiplayer game, I guess. It's sort of on the brink, right? But League of Legends clearly is an esports game. So Super League Gaming, Viacom, through their subsidiary Nickelodeon, invested into Super League Gaming, which, as I say, attempting to do a geolocated league. So let's go and look at that. Nickelodeon enters esports as part of $15 million funding round for Super League Gaming. So there we go. There's Viacom entering the space. Now let's go at GE, General Electric. General Electric owns the Philadelphia Fusion in part. This is their team. This is one of the Overwatch League teams. In fact, this was the team that made it to the final of the Overwatch League and finished runners-up. They also made it to, I think they were they in the final of a stage? I feel like they were. Yeah, I think they were in like the second stage final, maybe. I could be wrong on that one. I think they were. And just to confirm that, if you go on the Wikipedia entry for Philadelphia Fusion, the team is owned by Comcast Spectator, and Comcast Spectator is above that, obviously Comcast, which is owned at the top by GE, as I showed you with that graphic at the beginning of the show. Then we go, those are all 6 companies, but there was another one I thought I'd mention for News Corp, because you might be saying, come on, News Corp CGS, that was a decade ago, Thorin. Like, they literally stopped the CGS in 2008. It's 2019 now. Okay, let's go here. Caffeine. Okay, it's pre-release at the moment, but Caffeine, the concept is, it's a streaming service, in theory, like Twitch, like you see from YouTube. And who has invested into Caffeine? Oh, Fox, a subsidiary company of News Corp, has invested $100 million into the broadcasting platform Caffeine. 21st Century Fox there. This is from Reuters, so seems pretty legit, right? So there we go. We have all 6 companies buying up properties within the esports space, whether that's buying into leagues, buying into teams, buying into broadcasters, buying into media companies surrounding it. And as it stands right now, we're talking about spanning esports games like in the old days, CS Source from CGS, CSGO from E-League, Mortal Kombat E-League, Street Fighter 5, whatever Street Fighter version it is. Obviously, we've got Overwatch when we go to them buying up the Fusion with Comcast. We've got League of Legends with Super League Gaming. We've got many different games through, obviously, the likes of Caffeine, coming through the News Corp people. They're actually slowly, it's not like it's pervasive and they've bought up everything, it's overwhelming. There are a lot still of endemic companies and endemic brands and things that were built organically from esports that haven't yet been sold or bought off. But that's why I say the interesting thing for me about this video is to establish that these companies have their tentacles out throughout the scene, and then let's see what else they buy up. And more importantly, let's see who sells to these companies. Which organizations, teams, which tournament organizers, GMAX, MLGs, obviously they're sold to MTG and Activision Blizzard, which broadcasters, the Twitches of the world, the YouTubes of the world, all of these different companies, which ones of them will choose to sell out to bigger companies like that? Because there are lots of people who are endemic, organic esports people who will choose to sell and have done, as you've seen already in some of these examples I outlined, because they want to cash in now. They see this as currently, it obviously is, the zenith of how much esports properties are worth, as I alluded to before, with how cheaply, in the current context, Twitch was bought for, when you consider how much teams and tournament organizers and games are worth now. There's some people who will say, right, it's like Bitcoin. I don't know how much higher it's going to go. So you know what? The guy who bought in at Bitcoin from $10 and sold it for $5,000, yeah, you and I know it went up to $15,000, maybe more. But it doesn't matter. If he sold for $5,000, at the time, he was getting a mega deal. He was like, of course I'm selling now. This could go down at any time. It could go down even more. I've made a massive profit from this. So there are plenty of people, just as when the LCS began, you could sell slots for like roughly $1 million. There were plenty of people who just got a slot, won a slot from promotion, or sold a slot and just said, hey, I'll get the $1 million now, I'll get $2 million now, I'll get out. Whereas now we know they're all might be worth $100 million if they'd hold on for a few years. But there are plenty of people who they will want to cash in now, or they will be given their number, their price as it were, and they will think to themselves, I've made so much of so little, comparatively, that this is definitely worth it. Also, some of them won't believe in the future of esports. They might think this is actually the high point of the bubble. Is it ever going to be worth more than this? Will it ever be actually sustainable with cemented foundations where you can tangibly prove return on interest, and that when you put in this much money, you make exactly this money and the marketing's worth it for the... No one knows right now. It could be a social phenomenon. So there's plenty of people who are actually very shrewd people who will choose to kind of hop off the train now, get a load of money for doing so, and in doing so, who will they sell to? Almost certainly some of these massive companies along the way, because for those companies, they not only want to buy up properties in order to expand their portfolio and connect businesses, but also potentially to control things, right? So I want to see also how these big companies stack the businesses they buy, especially potentially through their subsidiaries, so people might not notice the connections or the potential conflicts of interest. Because broadcast and media companies buying out tournament organizers, teams, etc., that will actually be very significant for what happens with broadcast rights in the future. If broadcast rights for esports really become worth hundreds of millions, billions for individual esports games, then how much more beneficial is it for you to own the tournament organizer as well that's going to have that? Is to be a team that competes in that, as long as no one's stopping you, as long as there's no kind of antitrust type rules out there or some kind of conflict of interest directly on a legal scale. It will help you to be able to make use of that leverage, that money that you have invested there. If you have companies which complement each other, which work each other, which build into each other and are part of a certain structure that would be competing against each other, leveraging the highest amount of money if they were separate entities, right? If I own a team, let's ask this question, and someone buys the rights to the league that my team plays in, but the person who bought the rights at the top is a company that owns media companies that are rivals of mine at the top of who my company owns, then do I put pressure through my team and through a team organization, a cartel, to not sell to that particular person and sell someone else? You can see how a lot of backroom deals could be affected by the ownerships of these particular companies due to competition, due to the fact that at the top, they own so much of the media space already and therefore might influence who bids for certain things and who gets certain deals. Now, I've kind of alluded already quite heavily to the theme of why this is significant, because control of an industry is no small matter. It can have a big, big influence. It also can completely change the direction, the vision, the scope of the industry. Now, the idea that this gaming was its own sort of like alternative culture, it was kind of like a modern day digital counterculture to contrast to the 60s and the hippie culture, you know, it can't really be that if these massive mainstream companies and their subsidiaries gradually buy up the whole space. It will no longer be the case that that's just as the internet has also had similar issues happen in terms of how it is controlled, how it was bought up from where it was a digital Wild West before. Now, you could say that one thing that might slow the kind of onslaught or march of these companies to buy up esports properties is that unlike traditional sports, the NFL, the NBA, the game itself is owned by someone. The IP rights are owned, obviously, by the game devs in esports. And at this point in time, this is what's interesting, that will mean they retain some level of ultimate control over some of these particular aspects. Like they actually, in theory, have to give you permission to sell the broadcast rights. So actually, one day, it will probably be the game dev who's trying to be the one making the money from selling the broadcast rights. Likewise, in the future, those big, big media companies, if they get so that them own small subsidiaries, which then own companies in esports, are worth hundreds of millions of dollars, generating billions of dollars, they will probably be the people who go and push back against the game devs to try and win some of those IP rights and say, we're creating a product, it's part of the performance, it's part of the production that makes this a product, it's not just the game itself. It's Lionel Messi playing football and for Barcelona and in La Liga and with this television deal that makes it worth the money, not the fact he's using a football directly. The football is obviously integral, but it is not essential and the only part of the deal that should be considered viable in terms of generating the money and making it all possible, right? So there's a lot of different ways that can go on that, and you can't really trust that one's better than the other, but these are the ways that some of those companies could block, potentially actually help us, the consumer, out, but they could also hurt us as well in terms of how they could control it and how that will shape how we see esports in the future. This video was kindly supported by Dean Tanglis, Andreas Snazore Westerlund, Gardner Wilson, OllieJ, Tobias Bernasconi, NateDOhDoubleG, James Harding, Kyla Harris, Travis Greb, Daniel Yordanov, Tristan Jones, and a special thanks goes out to Jerky's Minion. Do you want to suggest a topic or a guest for upcoming content of mine? Perhaps you'd like to ask me a question for my monthly video AMA. Do you want some teasers to see who the next guests are for my talk shows, for my interviews? Maybe you'd like to take part in a monthly esports discussion with yours truly. Well, put your money where your mouth is at the Patreon link in the description box below and join the Scrilluminati today.